Welcome, everyone. Welcome at this lovely tent, and I'm actually really glad you all been here because it's actually almost lunchtime. But you've been here because probably you're all bird lovers, and the cool thing is nowadays, and that will the talk be all about. The talk will be all about actually the how do you say it? Logan is quite an interesting profile that he has because he is actually being interested in a lot of things and also good at a lot of things. And one of his passions is absolutely birding and being a bird watcher, but also he's quite intrigued with data and the journalism thing and visualizing it. And can we actually, if the birds are singing in our backyard, can we actually maybe in the future hear what they're having to say? I want to give a big applause to Logan and one little thing. Logan, actually, he doesn't have time for a Q&A, so I'm going off the stage, and after the talk, you can go and ask some questions to Logan directly. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and thank you all for coming to my talk, Is AI for the Birds the Beauty of Backyard Birdsong Data? So I'd like to start by talking a little bit about looking at things and what birdwatching taught me about paying attention. Botanists often talk about this idea of plant blindness or plant awareness disparity, that to many people, plants just look like this green blur, undifferentiated mass all around them. And I think a similar thing happens with birds. So how many people here know this bird? Shout it out if you know. Yeah. A meerkat, or Eurasian coot, of course. And I think the Netherlands, especially this crowd, is much more likely to know this bird than the global average. But even in the Netherlands, lots of people think that the meerkat is a type of duck, that it's related to this eend on the right. And it's really, if you look at it closely, that you start to notice that there's lots of little differences. One of my favorite differences that probably a lot of people have seen are their feet, which are these really weird-looking dinosaur feet that don't have duck webs, but instead these flaps. And I used to kind of think that learning the names wasn't that important. I subscribed to this idea, like Richard Feynman, that names are kind of a waste of time to memorize these things. This is something he talks about in one of his stories. When it came for time for me to give my talk on the subject, I started off drawing an outline of the cat and began to name the various muscles. The other students in the class interrupt me. We know all that. And then he says, like a complete asshole, "Oh," I say, "you do? Then no wonder I can catch up with you so fast after you've had 4 years of biology." They'd wasted all their time memorizing stuff like that when it could be looked up in 15 minutes. And I used to subscribe to that, but now I've really come to realize that names are a framework for interpreting the world. Names provide structure and meaning, and by learning the names of birds, all of a sudden what was once, "Oh, there's a bunch of ducks out on that lake," became, "Oh, I see a grebe, and I see a mallard, and I see a gadwall out there." It became a deeper sight. I could glance at the same scene and see more and understand more than I could previously. What was once a bunch of these loose, unsorted observations now had a tree on which they could hang. They had structure. And that's what names, that's what taxonomy is. It's structure. And changing the structure of your thought changes the way that you see. Once you know that they have different names, you start to notice differences in behavior and body structure and how they eat and how they fly, and in vocalizations, which brings me to bird songs. Bird songs are really challenging. Many birders find them difficult to learn. But through technology, we can understand more about bird songs. And I can't give this talk now without shouting out this video, which probably people have seen. It went viral a few days ago. This YouTuber, Ben Jordan, taught a bird how to make a specific sound. And one of the reasons he was able to do that, I think one of the coolest things in this video, is the science of how birds make sound. They're actually little synthesizers. They can produce different frequencies and frequency modulate them together. They have two independent oscillators, literally like a DX7. And in this video, what Ben does is he takes a sound here that represents an image, plays it to a bird, and the bird is able to reproduce it. And this image is represented as a spectrogram, which is a graph of frequency over time. It's a little bit like musical notation. So here you can see do, 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 do. And this is the same thing as a spectrogram, those same notes going down in frequency and then up and a longer one at the end. And this might seem really simple and obvious, this idea of a spectrogram, but it revolutionized the science of understanding bird calls. Previously, people had ears and qualitative onomatopoeic descriptions of things, and you'll still see these in bird guides sometimes, like, this bird sounds like sisiu, I guess. I find these really kind of useless because I don't know what's meant by that sound, and of course different languages use different sounds for letters anyway, but it was hard for a while because though these are easy to make now, they weren't in the 1950s. This is the K sonograph machine, the first commercially available machine for spectrographic analysis. And almost immediately, scientists were able to analyze things by turning this qualitative description into a quantitative one. And they could see how birds learned songs and how the process of changing something from a bunch of loose, unsorted warbles to something that sounds like the same consistent bird song. I also find that looking at spectrograms makes it easier to hear what I'm seeing, or to understand what I'm hearing. Here you can hear the horned lark, and try to follow along with the spectrogram. And it's easier with this canyon wren on the bottom. You hear that descending series of tones that slowly get slower and slower. And can we turn the volume up a little bit on this next one? I find that it can even change what we hear. So let's listen to this bird song. And how many notes do you hear? How many sounds? I hear 2, right? But if we look at the spectrogram and look really closely, we can actually see that there's this little break in the second note. There's this little kind of gap here. And now if we go back and listen to it, does anyone hear that it's actually twee, tweety? There's a little third song that comes in there. So the spectrogram can change the way that we hear the sounds that we're hearing. And spectrograms are also the way that machine learning models will identify species based on sound. The most famous and best one of these out there right now is BirdNet from the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. And what it does is it takes an audio file, converts it to a spectrogram with some parameters, and then runs a convolutional neural network on it that gives you bird species predictions. And most importantly, this is a completely open source thing with great documentation and a good example implementation, as well as a paper that goes into all the details about how they trained it. This is some of the data augmentation they did that I think is super cool. And BirdNet is in a lot of places. Maybe some people have encountered it in Merlin, which is a fantastic app also from the Cornell Lab that runs BirdNet on your phone and essentially turns your phone into Shazam for birds. You can hold it up to something that's singing, and it will tell you what it is. It's also what powers this amazing open source project called BirdNet Pi that continuously runs BirdNet on a Raspberry Pi to track all of the birds that it can hear around you. It's such a perfect open source project. Just look at this README. I love it. And it's also perfect, and I say this with lots of love, because it's essentially just lots of things duct taped together. You have shell scripts that capture audio and send it to Python that runs BirdNet and saves the results in a database. It generates some simple data visualizations, and then you have a bunch of PHP that can render a website for exploring your data. You want to do more detailed analysis on a specific species? Well, open up an entirely different module written in Streamlit for doing data analysis. And what this means is that even though it's kind of messy, it's super hackable. You can get in there, you can mess with any of these scripts, you can change the way it works, and that's, I think, for me, the real, the best quality of an open source project, is that you're not afraid to get in there and mess with it yourself. So when I first heard about BirdNet Pi, I got really excited. I set it up just a couple days later, curious what it would hear, but I didn't realize that it would almost immediately kind of change the whole way that I thought about the birds around me and what I actually noticed. But it did, and I couldn't stop thinking about the data it was collecting. I was listening to this thing all the time, checking its data every day, and this obsession turned into a project that I called Bird Signs and Cycles. How much of what we hear do we notice? A microphone on my balcony listened to the birds of Amsterdam, and suddenly, so did I. So this is a interactive data visualization project that takes 2 months of data from December and January, aggregates it by a day, and then plots the activity of each bird over the course of a day. This is a narrative that I wrote that kind of walks people through that data. And you can see that in the morning we have these roosting jackdaws and carrion crows right outside my bedroom window. They fly off in the morning. As the sun comes up, we see that level decrease, and then eventually they return later in the afternoon. It wasn't just noticing these patterns of, oh yeah, the birds do kind of all leave like right as the sun comes up, but it was also hearing things that I never would have been able to hear before, like the owls that were right outside my window the whole night, but most of the time I slept through. The sensor picked them up. If we can increase the volume a little bit. We're on the computer. What we're also hearing now is the actual audio that was captured by the Raspberry Pi as part of this. And each of these species kind of has their own routine. Day, of course, in the Vondelpark belongs to the parakeets. They were naturalized in the 1970s, and now they're all over the Randstad. There's no getting rid of them. And there's a particular kind of really cold winter morning where I wake up late that I associate with this sound, the Egyptian geese cackling in the distance. These days all kind of fall into their own predictable rhythm. Some songbirds begin their salutations promptly at sunrise, while others seem to take longer to wake up in these dark days. I'm excited to have a small window into these daily patterns and eventually their seasonality. As the days lengthen and breeding season begins in the spring, these patterns and these birds will change. In this data set, there's a single songbird that sings all night, the redwing. Is that real? I have seen redwings around the park, but they're not really common. And how confidently can the AI model distinguish this zeep from many other thrushes? Like the observation biases that are inherent in traditional birding, there's limitations everywhere to this approach. Despite this, I found it to be a valuable tool for training myself to look and listen a little deeper. So I made this from all of this data, and then I also made this interactive visualization where you can kind of just explore it and look in more detail at a particular bird. Like here's the gray heron, which is most active around sunrise, or the long-tailed tit, one of my favorite songbirds that wakes up a little bit later. Or we can look at a nocturnal bird like the tawny owl that we saw earlier, as it's rarely heard during the day. You can also just click around and listen to all of the sounds. And what I decided this was a kind of technology-enhanced observation. By collecting this data, I was more in tune with the patterns of what was happening around me with these daily cycles. And it wasn't just the birds. It was all of the things that the birds were connected to, the trees that they needed to roost in at night, the plants that they ate during the day, even the human activity and the sound of bicycles. I'd notice it differently because I was listening now for all of these bird songs. December is not the same month as January, even though it kind of feels like it in the middle of the winter. There's differences in the plants, and that changes how the birds behave. And as I was noticing all these things, I kept returning to this idea of bird sign, the ancient Greek and Roman practice of ornithomancy, or the idea that birds could predict the future or provide omens that would be important to know. And this wasn't just, kind of an idle curiosity. It was actually the way that people back then lived their lives. I love this quote from Plautus, a Roman playwright. "I have a favorable omen, a favorable sign. The birds let me go in any direction. The woodpecker and the crow on the left and the raven and the owl on the right recommend it. I've decided to follow your advice. But what's this? A woodpecker is tapping an elm? That cannot be due to chance." And I don't really believe in ornithomancy, though I did get some birds to tell my fortune a few weeks ago. But I think it's interesting that so many cultures still today think there's some hidden wisdom in the birds. And as Ashley Green points out in her book, Bird in Roman Life and Myth, there's something to that. Cranes really do tell the farmer when it's time to sow their fields, or the sailor when it's safe to go out to sea. And even a rooster has some celestial knowledge that seemed really mysterious to people back when we didn't have accurate clocks, for instance. I exhibited this piece at Maasfest in 2024 at the Tolhuis Town in Amsterdam, and it was really fun to see other people relate this to their own experiences. I always knew I wanted to do something once I had a full set of data, 4 seasons of data. And birders talk a lot about this idea of a big year, trying to see as many birds as possible in a single year. For me, 2024 was more of a medium year. Yeah, I saw a lot of birds, but the birds were also a medium for my experience, a way of interpreting life change, environmental catastrophe, and political apocalypse through a different perspective. It was also, of course, a great opportunity for some more data visualization. So I made a follow-up piece that's a kind of calendar that uses a whole year's worth of bird data and presents it in a narrative way with a combination of my own personal experiences and milestones and events in environment and in climate change. All of this is set against a backdrop of this very personal data collected on my balcony about local birds. Each month has its own featured birds that either stood out in the data or were important and narratively. December, of course, is the month of the jackdaws and crows that we looked at in the first project. By January, the sensor started to hear more coots and moorhens. And for each of these birds, there's one day where the sensor picked out more of that bird than it had ever been seen on any other day. That's here, for instance, on January 10th, there were more coots calling than on any day we'd previously seen. There's also these little kind of barcode color visualizations for each day to add some texture that highlight the ratio and amount of birds that were heard. You can compare it to the moorhen, which peaked on the 7th. February brought a long bike ride to see my very first owls in the Netherlands, and later in the month, the extinction of a Hawaiian honeycreeper, officially declared on February 26th. May brought the sensor's first detection of the common swift, which really announces summer's arrival from Africa. They nest in buildings in the Netherlands where they will, for the first time since the summer previous, stop flying. They spend their whole winter, 9 months of the year, in continuous flight in Africa, catching bugs until they fly back to the Netherlands. June was the peak month for owls and night herons, which is a bird that I have strong associations with back from the United States. And July brought 2 of my favorite Dutch birds, the storks that nested in the park outside of my house and their beak clacking. They're now around all winter, but they're still more loud in the summer than they are in the winter. And blackbirds, which enjoyed a very wet July and were catching worms everywhere. The calendar ends, I should mention as well, July was also the hottest year in recorded history, and when the Earth passed 1.5 degrees of warming for the first time, which is marked on the calendar. The narrative ends with another freeform data visualization, this time taking a repeating linear approach instead of a circular projection. It lets you see the patterns, like the fact that the wren mainly sings in the spring, or that the robin sings in both the fall and the spring. And it also ends by kind of taking all of those little day bar charts that we saw and creating an abstract representation of the whole year, textural variation in the birds that reflects the changing of the seasons. You can't quite tell what birds there are here, and you're not meant to. Something that's maybe meant more to exist in kind of an installation space like here at the NYU Interactive Telecommunications Camp show, but you can also check it out online on my website if you're curious. But one thing kept kind of haunting me as I went through this whole process of making this project. Why was I doing this? And to be honest, I'm still not entirely sure. I don't know who I was making it for, though I kind of decided eventually for myself. It didn't really need to have a purpose. It was data art, not data visualization for some company. And that's also why there's no mobile version of this, you know? Not everything has to be mobile friendly. I believe that strongly. One thing that I really like about collecting data with this sensor is that it's both linked to everything else and it's very specific to my own experience. It ends up feeling very personal, even before adding the context of life events and my own thoughts. Even the days where there's no data have meaning. But of course, this is also all linked to the broader world through these birds and their cycles of daily activity and migration. And even though those cycles seem so regular, they're changing. There's this phenomenon called the shifting baseline syndrome, or environmental amnesia, where each generation thinks a normal amount of biodiversity is less than the generation before. And collecting these observations, turning it into a data art piece, it feels like some way to push back against that. So maybe you want to observe some birds in your backyard. Maybe you want to build one of these yourself. It's really simple. All you need is a Raspberry Pi and a USB microphone. That's seriously it. And then there's some software to install, which is pretty straightforward. I really recommend this fork of the project, just because it's a little bit more recently maintained. The part that takes the most thought is the physical installation. Where are you going to put it? And what's the microphone going to point at? If you have a backyard with green space, then that's obviously the best, but you might be a little bit constrained by your apartment or house. I just had a small apartment with a balcony, so what I did, which I thought worked quite well, was just putting the USB microphone outside and then running the USB cable through my window frame so that the Raspberry Pi and the power supply could stay inside out of the weather. But there's no reason not to get creative. If you have more space, a solar panel that powers a remote listening station could be really cool. And it's easy to do fun things with the data as well. All of your bird detections just get stored in a SQLite database that you can do queries against. And the audio recordings are saved as .wav files labeled with the date and species. It's fun to hack around on this, like I mentioned, and you can, for example, store the entire set of class predictions from the neural network instead of just the peaks. Though that database becomes gigabytes within a few hours. If you take an ultrasonic microphone and connect it to a BirdNet Pi, you get an automated bat detection project. Batty BirdNet Pi implements this well, and I've built one of these using an Open Acoustic Devices audio moth, which is a fantastic open source hardware, ultrasonic microphone, and high-frequency audio interface. Can you make sure the audio is high on the computer? So here's a bat that I recorded in the Netherlands. I'll play it in real time. And you can't hear anything because it's ultrasonic. And if I play it 10 times slower, you can hear these echolocation chips, these, in this case, like 48 kilohertz pulses it's sending out. And this is pitch shifted after being recorded, but there's lots of interesting ways to extend this and things that I want to keep hacking on, like doing real-time pitch shifting on the Batty BirdNet Pi. Here's some more bats from outside of the Netherlands. And unfortunately, the existing species ID models only cover Europe and North America. But this bat ID uses BirdNet. It's the same machine learning model, just with transfer learning applied to a different set of labeled audio files. So maybe my next project, or your next project, if you're interested, please talk to me, could be trying to train some more bat ID models using open sources of audio. And that brings me back to this question of why I find this so satisfying to work on. Ornithology in particular, but increasingly all kinds of biodiversity studies, really relies on citizen science. And ornithology has a really long-standing relationship with citizen science. Keeping lists of the birds that you see started as an idle hobby. And today, websites like eBird and Varnaming collect these observations from people all around the world, and they're actually used by scientific research. Hundreds or thousands of articles have been written using eBird data to study bird conservation. And finally, it's data from my local environment, from my backyard. And as everything is shifting due to climate change, habitat loss, and who knows what other unknown factors we'll discover are disrupting our biosphere, it feels really important to measure a line now and say, this is what it's like. Here, now, I observed it. It's only an observation, but that's better than nothing. Thank you for coming to my talk. Please feel free to find me afterwards if you want to ask any questions or chat about birds. You can also send me an email or follow me on Blue Sky or on Fedi. And my website with all of my projects is there as well. Thank you.